We return to Hilchot Avodah Zarah, Hilchot Hagoyim, and we are in the initial list of Misvot Aseh Burot Aseh at the beginning of these halachot. So Misvah Dalet, I think, perhaps we're up to. Shelo Ya'avod Otha Kederech Avodatha. The sur of worshipping any form of Avodah Zarah is defined according to the surah, the often, the way in which this particular Avodah Zarah is usually worshipped by those who worship it. If one worships it in a different fashion, one will be patur as opposed to hayav. One will not be liable in the same way. Hey, shelo yishtahawela, not to bow before any Avodah Zarah, even if that's not necessarily the way of its worship. Shelo la'asot pesel asmo, one is not allowed to make any kind of idol statue. Shelo la'asot pesel afilu la'achirim, and not to do so for others. Shelo la'asot suroth afilu l'noi. In other words, again, statues of human form, shall we say, are not to be made even for purely aesthetic reasons, nothing to do with any religious conviction. Shelo lehadiach achirim achareha, not to cause others, not to incite others to worship or to take seriously any form of Avodah Zarah. Lisrof ir hanidahath. This is a special category which has to do with a town, a city, a place where Avodah Zarah was worshipped and accepted by a majority of the people in that place, in that town. Such a place is to be destroyed. And the inhabitants are to be put to death. And not by Beit Din, by the way. Era b'derech shel milchama. B'cherev, as Rambam, as is Mefurash in the Pasuk, and as also Rambam mentions in Moreh Nevuchim. Shelo livnotha, not to rebuild it, that place. Shelo lehanot mikol mamuna, when we destroy it. It is to remain an everlasting monument to how we deal with Avodah Zarah, and we do not benefit from it in any way. Shelo lehasith yahid le'uvdah, not to incite, to cause any individual to worship it. Shelo lehanot mikol, shelo lehov hamesith, and not to literally to love, but the meaning here is to justify and make excuses for this person, the person involved, these activities, which lead to Avodah Zarah. So we have to hate such a person. Shalol la'azov sinatho, as Rambam says here again. Shalol lehasilo, not to save him in the Beit Din, not to try and find a way to justify him so that he be found innocent, or at least misafek, that he should not benefit from the doubt. Shalol l'amid alo zechuth, and therefore we do not, even if someone may have thought of some way of being melamed zechuth, you're not to do so when it comes to this kind of person. Here, I think I will mention and add that I think the same applies. It's a different area, but the principle, I think, is the same. I'm referring to justifying or explaining away the actions of our enemies towards the Jewish people. There are some people who almost specialize in doing this. They can always explain to you that it's only some of them and it's not all of them, and they didn't mean this, and you have to understand why. And this is precisely, of course, what we must not do, because that weakens our resolve and our ability to fight and destroy the enemy. As we see here, I think the same applies. It's not written explicitly in the case of warfare, and I think the reason that it is not written is straightforward and simple. It never occurred to anybody that that normal people would search and seek out, and if you seek and search hard enough, you will find ways and reasons to justify or to at least ameliorate the severity of the actions of the Jewish people's enemies. Quite the opposite. What we should do is quite the opposite, as we see here. Shilo yimana milelamed ala chava. That basically fits exactly what we just said. It's also in with regards to matters of warfare, etc. And the same applies to Avodah Zarah, as we see here. Shilo yimana milelamed ala chava. And there's an obvious connection between these two matters, because everything to do with Avodah Zarah has to do with the spiritual health of the Jewish people. Whereas fighting and destroying the enemy who seeks to destroy us has everything to do with the physical welfare and success of the Jewish people. And in both cases, it's perfectly reasonable to assume that we should not look for any possible reason or argument to lessen their burden of guilt. Miswa Kaf Aleph. No, I'm sorry. Miswa Yod Teth. Shelo litnabe bishma. It is a sort of a person to claim that he received some nevuah in connection with this Avodah Zarah, which is obviously a false claim. Miswa Kaf Shelo lishma mina mitnabe bishma. And similarly, we are not to take any notice and not listen for one moment to such a person. And this has to do, by the way, with the Jewish people's rejection of Yeshua HaNosri, Shem Roshaim Yirkav, because according to what is recorded in their books, he made certain statements and was responsible for certain practices, which most definitely reminiscent of, at least by way of implication, of Avodah Zarah. So it was asur to listen and to accept anything that he had to say. Kaf Aleph, shelo lehitnabe b'sheker, va'afilu b'shem Hashem, not to lie in any way about any nevuah that one claims to have received. Even if you say, the Hashem said such and such to me, but to claim this when it is false is a terrible averah, nevi sheker. And therefore we also are not to fear, not to hesitate putting such a person to death. Again, we see that all these matters, because they are so fundamental to the Jewish people's spiritual health as individuals and as a society, that there is no room for mercy and no room for equivocation with regards to such things. And I would add, again, connecting it in some way to current events, and not just current events, events that have been going on for many, many, many years and many generations, in fact, not to find reason to somehow excuse the all manner of ideology and philosophy, political thought, which is harmful to the Jewish people. Not to claim, for example, that, well, these people are just, they don't mean to do something wrong. They really believe this and they think they're doing the right thing, and they have good intentions. You could say the same about many people involved in various forms of Avodah Zarah. Not to mention the fact that a person may be misguided and gullible to the extent that they believe a certain ideology or a certain claim that, well, if we were only to give these people, these enemies, a state of their own, then that would be the end of the the problem, the conflict. I, in fact, heard precisely such a statement just yesterday by Professor Emeritus Benny Morris, who used to teach in the Ben Gurion University. He invented the term the new historians. He is one of these revisionist historians, revisionist in the sense that he supports the claim that there is such a thing as a Palestinian people, even though he admits it's a new phenomenon, and he also admitted within minutes of making that statement, he admitted in this interview that, and he claimed, first of all, he claimed immediately following that statement that therefore they have a right to self-determination. They have to have a state, and if we don't give them a state, then there'll be no end to the conflict. It will go on indefinitely, and therefore we wish to bring an end to this reality, and therefore we must agree to a state. But then, when asked how will this work, he says, yes, it has to, most definitely, it has to be demilitarized. But he says, but I admit freely that if you ask me, how will it be, this demilitarized status be maintained? How will this be the case for ongoing reality? He says, I have no idea. It says so in so many words. As you may guess from the name, Benny Morris, he sounds, at least originally, to be British, but the interview was in Hebrew, and he so yes, they need to have a state, and yes, it would pose a tremendous danger, but he has no idea how this might be brought about in such a manner that it would be, in his eyes, a safe option. Well, one doesn't need to speak at any great length to what extent such a person is a danger to the Jewish people. Yes. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Sort of.
Would you say that the lack of empathy we should have for Avodah Zarah applies to the positions of evil Jews in general?
It's not a question of my opinion. This is what Hazal say explicitly in in a number of places. And if we're seeing that we're looking here at Hilchot Avodah Zarah v'Chokot HaGoyim, if you turn to Perek Asiri for a moment, you will see that Rambam makes this connection, by the way, or at least the halacha relates to these different types of enemies in the same way. The beginning of this Perek Asiri halacha Aleph, perhaps I'll bring it up on the screen. You should be able to see it now in a moment. Hilchot Avodah Zarah Perek Yod, 10th chapter, the beginning. This halakha, by the way, was heavily censored in Tfus Vilna, in the Vilna edition. And there it says, En Korathim Berith Shivat HaMamim. This halakha has nothing to do with Shivat HaMamim. That's a very clumsy piece of censorship. Even in the early printings of the Rambam, such as the first printing, Shnat Resh Mem, 1480, Leminyanam, in Rome, right next door to the Vatican, was the first complete edition of Rambam. And there it says explicitly also what it's supposed to say, which is what it says here, En korathim barith avodah zarah. We are not allowed to form any pact or any kind of truce or peace agreement with in our land. People we're talking about within Eretz Yisrael, people who initially anyhow, people who worship Avodah Zarah, because that would be a cancer within the Jewish polity. And Rambam explains, he says, En korathim barith avodah zarah kadesh na'asa imaham shalom v'naniach otham le'ovdam. So we're talking about some kind of an agreement, a treaty, a pact, to allow them to live as they please, as what is called live and let live, which in such a case is not an option. And we would leave them in peace, and they would leave us in peace. And allow them to continue in their ways. You shall not make any treaty or agreement with them. They must recant any belief in any such practice, and all they are to be put to death. The Jewish people cannot have such pernicious influences residing within itself. It's truly like a cancer. And it's forbidden to have mercy on them. And you'll see the connection that we immediately discover here in a moment between Avodah Zarah and Milhama, which will serve perhaps to substantiate what I was saying before about the connection between these two things. We must not have mercy on them. We must not in any way cause our determination to deal with them as the Torah instructs to dissipate. If one sees a Gentile who worships Avodah Zarah, we'll see in a moment this also applies to a Jew. By the way, it's not a racist halakha, but the normal situation would be we're talking about a non-Jew. So it says Im ra'a goy oved Avodah Zarah oved or tove'at banahar. So if you see a non-Jew who you know, or you can assume, because everybody in that locale is so inclined, he worships a certain type of Avodah Zarah, which was the case, for example, if you think about the situation, let's say 2,000 years ago in Eretz Yisrael, or for that matter, anywhere in the known world, essentially. But let's talk about, for now, the Roman Empire, which was a huge swath of territory. Certainly before the rise of Christianity, although Christianity is also Avodah Zarah, but even if you were to claim that it's not so, and Rambam says explicitly that the Christians are of the Avodah Zarah, he says so explicitly in these halachot. But even if that were not the case, let's say we're talking about pre-Christian times. Well, you know that every Roman, every Greek, and every other type of Mediterranean Gentile that lived in any Jewish area worshipped all the various, I'm not going to mention them by name, but all the various Roman and Greek gods, etc. We all know that practices are well known historically. documented. The Mishneh and the Talmudim discuss them in great detail as well. So you could make this assumption, as the Ramban and others quoting him in Masechet Makot Daf Taith mentioned that a non-Jew that you do not know from in such an area, in such a locale, in such a time of history, one makes the assumption, because it's almost an unerring, unfailingly correct assumption that this person is a worshipper of Avodah Zarah. Everybody was. There was no such thing as an atheist. Perhaps there were a handful of Greek philosophical types who bandied about certain ideas. Perhaps they're not really gods, or how many gods, or we don't know, whatever. But this was not the zeitgeist. That was not what people thought, and not what people did, except for the odd exception. And when people wanted to deal with someone who caused them too much strife or pain, such as Socrates, the best claim against him in order to execute him was to claim that he denied the truth of the gods, which is exactly what they did. They didn't like what he was doing and saying about various things, so he was put to death. And the official crime was that he doubted the veracity and the existence of the various gods. So if one sees such a person in a life-threatening situation, such as drowning, lo ya'danu, you should not save him, because he's hayav mitha anyhow, as we see as Rambam discusses in the Hilchot Melachim u'Milchamoth, that he's transgressing one of the Sheva Mitzvot b'nei Noach. Ra'ahu lakuach lamaweth. A person sees a Jew sees such a person in a life-threatening situation. Lo yatzilenu, should not save him. But to proactively kill this person, asur. Why? Yes, he's transgressing one of the Sheva Mitzvot b'nei Noach, and he is hayav mitha, but he has to be brought before a Beth Din, and therefore you're not allowed to do that off your own bat. If you can bring him before the Beth Din, then yes, you're required to do so. But just to, as in a vigilante way, do away with him, that's asur. Why? Because he's not in a state of war with us. Of course, you hear the opposite from this statement, that if he is in a state of war with us, then that's exactly what you do. And that's the halakha that we've discussed before. And this is how Rambam quotes this halakha in this way. And Rambam immediately continues and says, this refers to a Gentile. Aval, Mosarei Yisrael, a Jew. He may keep Shabbat even. He may go to the Bet Midrash, but he's a Moser. Mosarei Yisrael. He informs other Jews to the foreign authorities, to the Roman authorities, shall we say, or it could be to the Russian secret police in Tsarist times. It makes no difference. There were many such cases. Aval Mosarei Yisrael, Wahaminim, Epikorisim. These are various types of apostates. Epikoros is someone who denies the possibility of nufuah and the doctrine that Hashem is in control of the world. Hashem is mashgiach ba'olamo. Or Amin is someone who worships Avodah Zarah, or who believes in some other spiritual, philosophical ideology which undermines the Torah. The classic case, and this is why Chazal used this term to refer to the early Christians as minim, because clearly the not certainly at that time, and even today, but today perhaps with regards to certain sects it is less clear, but normal mainstream Christianity, and without even today, but certainly at that time, involved Avodah Zarah, taking a human being and elevating that person to the status of a god. It's not that they're also included in such a response. In other words, the response to these people is even more severe and more automatic. In the case of the non-Jew, if he's not in a state of war, then you don't do anything. If he's not in a state of war with us, with the Jewish people, then you don't do anything. You don't save him and you don't harm him. Unless you can bring him to a Beit Din, where the Beit Din will discover the truth about this person and what should be done with him. But with regards to these people within the Jewish people, precisely because they're within the Jewish body politic, they're part of the Jewish community, they are to be destroyed proactively, directly, without hesitation. Because they do two things. They used to inform, like Musirim, used to, in other words, actively cause terrible harm, damage, and suffering to the Jewish people, either the individuals or the community or whatever. And because they also, their actions, their beliefs, what they say, what they preach, what they write, leads people astray. In other words, has to do with the concept of Masith Umadiah, a person who incites others to worship Avodah Zarah, as we were discussing before. And Rambam says explicitly, Ki Yeshua HaNosri. This, of course, doesn't appear in all the editions. Ki Yeshua HaNosri. And you can imagine, even in the first edition in Rome, in Resh Mem, these words were removed, of course, for obvious reasons. But as I recall, I'm not going to check it now. I have it next to me here, but I won't check it right now. But as I recall, they left a gap. There's a blank space. So you can guess, but it doesn't say anything. Ki Yeshua HaNosri v'talmido v'sadok v'vaitos v'talmidahem shem roshaim yirkav. So you see, in these halachot, there is a connection between, there is a certain connection or analogy being made between enemies in the earthly and physical sense, and enemies in the spiritual sense. Very well, we continue. I return to the list of halachot at the beginning. Oh, just one moment. You should be able to see this now. All right, so we're in halacha. I'm sorry, mitzvah kaf gimel. Shelo nishava b'shem avodah zarah, not to swear in the name of avodah zarah, even if it's only a kind of off-the-cuff expression. We know how various Gentiles swear to certain things, even without really intending to swear, but they mention the name of this or that deity. A Jew is not allowed to do that, even if he doesn't really mean what he's saying. Shelo la'asot of, and these are specific types of witchcraft, sorcery, etc., which was always connected with Avodah Zarah. Shelo la'asot of, shelo la'asot yid'oni, shelo la'avir lamolech, shelo la'hakim l'seva. These are all various types of Avodah Zarah that were common. Shelo l'ishtahavoth al even maskit. That is why we are not allowed to bow down, to prostrate ourselves on a stone floor, stone surface. I don't think, by the way, that ceramic tiles on the floor are the same as a stone surface. This is a question that I've been asked. Nor do I think that even what we call in Israel balatot, these the old style of floor tiles that were used, which you can still find in various places, which they do actually have some pieces of stone in them, but it's mainly some kind of concoction of some special glues and other substances with bits of stone that was all compressed together at high pressure and then smoothed over and polished, what have you. It's not a piece of stone. It doesn't look like a piece of stone. And I don't think that is considered Nevin Maskith. So if a person wants to know, can one mishtahave, can one bow down in a Beth Knesset, shall we say, that has such a floor? I think the answer is yes. If it's a real stone floor, the answer is no. Shalolita Asherah, not to plant an Asherah, and also a tree that was commonly used in the time in early period, going time of Bayit Rishon. This was a common form of Avodah Zarah. It was always associated with Avodah Zarah. Labed Avodah Zarah v'chol ha'na'asa b'shvilah. We are to destroy all manner of all types of objects and all paraphernalia and anything attached to Avodah Zarah. Shelo lehanoth me'avodah zarah v'chol meshamresheha, not to benefit in any way from anything to do with Avodah Zarah, which means not to benefit from an idol, a statue, which is connected to Avodah Zarah, until it's in some way deformed, as we shall see. Shelo lehanoth mitzipuye ne'evad. Let's say you have an idol which is gold plated, so you can't benefit from the gold plating on that either. Shelo lichroth berith Avodah Zarah. That's the halacha we just spoke about in Perek Asiri a moment ago. Not to come to some arrangement and understanding with such people. Shelo lahon alehem, not to not to find any reason to make excuses for them or to treat them in a positive way. Shelo yeshavu ba'arsenu, that they should not dwell in our land. This is an interesting concept, which we'll see later, which many ostensibly religious Jews have a lot of difficulty with, because they are thinking in foreign terms. I'm sure all of you, I certainly can attest to this in my own experience. Many Jews who keep Shabbat, who keep Kasher, who go to Beth Knesset even 3 times a day, if you tell them that the cannot be in our land for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that they wish to exterminate us, that might be just one reasonably convincing argument, but there are others, many others, in fact. If you suggest this to them, what will they do? They will first of all go into a state of shock, almost catatonic shock. They're almost unable to speak sometimes. How can you say such a thing? It's undemocratic. They're citizens. For example, I think I mentioned in a certain gathering of residents in my yeshuv some time ago, so a certain person stood up and opined that we cannot prevent so-called Lud Tudot Zahud entering the yeshuv. It's against the law. So someone pointed out that, in other words, you're suggesting that it's perfectly okay if one of these people enters the yeshuv and kills someone in the yeshuv, as long as it's done according to the law. Well, that's not my position, and I imagine neither is it your position. They will tell you that, and it's not all of them; it's only some of them, and there are many who just want to live in peace and look after their families, etc. Which is very interesting, because if it were so few who are really our enemies, and then it's interesting how all those that very small and insignificant number of people always manage to be everywhere at the same time, throwing rocks, shooting guns, doing whatever. I mean, I know a young man just the other day, literally, he was driving somewhere right next to Kiryat Arba, and they have uprooted a road sign from the side of the road with the concrete base. So they've uprooted that all, and they somehow managed to place it in the road. And anyhow, he drove over it and damaged his car. Baruch Hashem, he wasn't injured himself, but his car was damaged, as you might imagine. It's interesting how that tiny minority is always is everywhere at the same time doing these things. It's really they must be working overtime. Very, very impressive on their part, how energetic and industrious they are. And similar arguments, exactly the kinds of things we said a moment ago that one should not be saying about her enemies. That Lola lamed alehem zechut, as we said, this was in Miswa יודלת לא לאהוב את המסית, שלא לעזוב שנאתו, שלא להסילו, שלא ללמד עליו זכות, שלא להימנע מלמד עליו חובה. Exactly the same must apply to our physical enemies. Why would it not apply? It's obvious, but apparently to some it's not so obvious. It's like the expression common sense. A wise man once said that I don't use that term as it isn't. That Jews should be distinct and separate and different from Goyim in their appearance and their practices and habits and dress. These are various types of magical and esoteric practices, and they're always connected to Avodah Zarah, because if you're trying to predict the future, which is lenahesh, shelo liksom, or to perform some form of magic, and shelo le'onen, not these are all types of magical, all kinds of types of magical and ritual practices. And shelo lahavor hever, shelo lidrosh el hamethim. Why does a person conduct a séance, which is lidrosh el hamethim? In order to predict or to tell or to connect or discover something. In other words, you believe that you can connect to some power and do certain things, and Hashem is out of the picture. He cannot prevent it. He's not in charge. You can basically circumvent him. So Avodah Zarah is the same also. You can circumvent Hashem. You want rain? Well, there's a goddess for that, and all you have to do is have sexual relations with the priestess from the local temple of the Baal on the soil of your field, which is how it was done, and then to guarantee the success of your crop. The Romans did this also, by the way. People just don't know, but that's the fact. This was part of Roman Avodah Zarah culture, etc. At some point, they somehow chose to remove the actual sexual act from the ritual, so that the farmer and the priestess from the local Roman temple only sort of lay together and pretended to have relations on the soil of his field. But in earlier times, they didn't involve themselves in such niceties. But all these kinds of things are ways of circumventing the only true power and koach, which is Hashem. So Avodah Zarah, magic, sorcery, they're all one of a kind. Membet, shelo lish'ol be'ov. And again, not to avail yourself of such things, not to go to such a person. Shelo lish'ol be'ida'oni, shelo lechashef, shelo lehak. So these are all ways of trying to avail yourself of such knowledge or such claims. Memhe shelo lehakifeth pa'ath harosh. Again, this has to do with not being like these people, being separate from them, as we saw in Miswa Lamud shelo lehidamoth. So this was how their hairstyle, kind of Viking hairstyle, shaved. Most of the head was shaved or something like that. So that's called lahakafath harosh, specifically the sides of the head. Shelo lahashhith pa'ath zakan, and the same applies to the beard. Shelo ya'adha ish adi isha. not that men and women should not interchange clothing or hairstyles or ornaments. Shilo ta'adeh isha adi ish. Shelo lichtov ka'aka, not to tattoo oneself. Shelo lihitgoded, and not to slash oneself as a sign of mourning or as some kind of religious devotion, as the Shiites do, for example. They have certain days where they go about and bashing themselves on their head and slicing themselves and what have you. That's called lihitgoded. Shelo la'asot korha alameth, not to tear out one's hair as a sign of aveluth. In fact, we do the opposite. We grow our hair. Uve'u kol mitzvot ha'elu bifrakim elu. All right, let us begin. Perek Rishon, Halacha Aleph. B'yimei Enosh, ta'u b'nei ha'adam ta'ut gedola. Enosh, of course, was the grandson of Adam Rishon, as recorded in Sefer Bereshit. And it says, of course, explicitly in the Torah, the end of Perek Revi'i in Sefer Bereshit, it says, "U'Lashem gam hu yulad ben v'yikra et shemo Enosh, az uhal likro b'shem Adonai." So this is understood as indicating the beginnings of Avodah Zarah amongst what we would call civilized humanity, or semi-civilized at least. They all were misled. And their leaders also were lacking in understanding. And Enosh himself was amongst these people himself. What was their mistake? Seeing that the Creator created all these things that we see in the heavens, in order that they should be responsible for the running of the world as people understood. The heavenly bodies were seen as divine bodies. They were, and the days of the week were connected to these heavenly bodies because they were considered divine. So, the god of thunder was Thor, so you have Thursday, right? And you have Saturn was a fairly visible planet, and it's therefore a god of some kind of divine force, and it has an impact on what goes on Earth, and therefore you have Saturday, which is Saturn Day, etc. And Moon Day is Monday, and Monday and Sunday is the day of the sun, etc. Very obvious, because this was almost all peoples, all cultures were rooted in this kind of astronomical Avodah Zarah. In other words, connecting the various heavenly bodies to some kind of deity. So seeing that Hashem created these things, وَهَلَكْ لَهَمْ كَvod. In other words, Rambam is saying that these people initially thought it must be a creator, but we don't see this creator. We see these planets, we see the stars, we see these various things. And Hashem placed them there. وَهَمْ شَمَشِيم هَمْ شَمَشِيم لَفَنَوْ, and they serve him. رُؤِيمْ هَمْ لَشَبْهَمْ وَلَفَأَرَامْ وَلَحَلُقْ لَهَمْ كَvod. It is therefore proper and necessary to worship them, to praise them. And this is the will of the Creator that we do not see, that we do not know directly. לגדל ולכבד מי שגידלו וכיבדו, to show respect and even to worship and to display deference towards these things that Hashem gave honor to. כמו שהמלך רוצה לכבד עבדיו והעובדים לפניו, as a king wishes that his ministers, his servants, etc., be honored because they belong to him. وزاه كبدو של המלך. In other words, what Rambam is suggesting here, as Rambam discusses in Moreh Nevuchim, is that initially they did not believe that creating a large, impressive idol of Jupiter, called Jupiter, the Roman Jupiter, who was the king of the gods in their the chief god in their cosmology and religion. And the reason is obvious. If you look at the night sky, Jupiter is very visible and bright and dominant, and so therefore, obviously, he's the chief of these gods. So they didn't believe that this idol that they created was the god, but it was a representation of and something, therefore, that you need to have something to look at to see with your own eyes. So they created these things, but they didn't believe that the idol itself was the god. Later, perhaps many people did, or the simple people did, but certainly that was not the original intention. The Torah, on the other hand, disallows any form of any kind of representation or any intermediary between man and Hashem. And this is, for many people, difficult. If you want to understand how difficult it is, you should perhaps visit 770 Ocean Parkway, and you'll see how difficult it is for people to relate to Hashem without some image, without some monstrously large photograph in their Bet Midrash, for example. And seeing that this is how people viewed things, and this was universal, all people, whether it's Vikings or the Inca in South America, or African tribes in Africa, or ancient Russian tribes, Polish tribes, Celtic tribes. They're all involved, and they're all somehow connected to this. They're all influenced by and all accept this general theory and religious belief. People began to build temples, large buildings. A hechal is a large temple, a large building. And they would build images, idols, and they would bring sacrifices to them. And they would author prayers to them, hymns, etc. And bow down to them according to their misguided and evil conceptions. They thought that by doing so they would find favor in the eyes of the Creator. This was the initial fundamental conception, and these were the beginnings of Avodah Zarah. I'm sorry, v'chach. So if we go back to Hilchot Avodah Zarah for a moment. You'll be able to see now. So this is now Halacha Beth. No, Halacha Gimel. Uchachim omrim Avodah hayoda'im ikara. In other words, the mevinim, the philosophers, the more profound in thinking amongst them, say this quite openly. Lo shehen omrim she'en sham Eloah ela kochav zeh. They don't claim there is no creator except for this image that we worship, or what have you, or this star that we worship. We worship the star because it reminds us, or it connects us in some way to the Creator. This is what Yirmiyahu states: "Mi lo yira'acha melech hagoyim, ki lecha yira'acha, ki b'chol chachmei hagoyim v'chol malchutam me'en kamocha, uvahath yiv'alu v'yichsalu musar havolim aithu." So this pasuk where Yirmiyahu states, "There is none like you, Hashem," and all the goyim have been led astray, and many Jews have been led astray, as we know from Sefer Yirmiyahu that he is constantly speaking of the Avodah Zarah that was pervasive in his time, in his place. Everyone knows that you are the Creator. Their mistake is, their misconception is, they have accepted the notion that these kinds of practices that we have developed to worship visible objects, whether it's a star or a planet in the heavens, or whether it's an idol that you created, so this is your will, or this is acceptable, and this is desirable, and that it's also beneficial to those of us who do these things. So they thought. Tov, we shall end here today.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Out of curiosity, what was the outcome of that meeting in your yeshuv?
There was not really an outcome, although a majority of people did not accept that position that I described. But there is a mazkirut in the yeshuv, and many people, including myself, said that this has to be decided not by the mazkirut, by a handful of people, but by some kind of referendum, as has been done on certain other things in the past. But that referendum has not taken place yet. And I know there is currently a letter going around that I signed as well, demanding that such a thing take place, because it has many, many ramifications. That's what I know as of today. Tov, heyu beruchim. Hizku v'yames levavchem kol ha'meyachalim l'Adonai. Shalom u'nitzachon.
Thank you, Rabbi Bar-Hayim. We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.